Hey everyone, thanks for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers. Asking for your help tonight because even though we have record numbers of subscribers here on Reluctant Preppers trying to spread the word about preparedness and self-reliance and awareness, we've been receiving reduced revenue from our YouTube videos being marked as advertiser unfriendly and having to curtail the content and the descriptions and the topics and the guests that we can introduce. So with your help, we can overcome that and break free of that restriction. If you go to patreon.com/reluctantpreppers, you can make any amount of small or modest or larger monthly donation to help support our mission. We've established goals there to help bring you even more content with the different levels that we can achieve together. Thanks, folks. Check it out, patreon.com/reluctantpreppers. And now, on to our main event.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're glad to have a returning guest tonight, Bill Murphy, co-founder of GATA.org, the Gold Antitrust Action Committee, is here with us again on Reluctant Preppers. Bill has been a vigilante for truth and for accountability in the precious metals market. He and the other compatriots at GATA.org have successfully prosecuted government entities and other regulatory bodies for not enforcing fair market and free market regulations that have been affecting illegal price suppression, as has been proven in some other courts of law about the precious metals market. He's back with us again here on Reluctant Preppers to tell us what's going on and what lies ahead for gold and silver. Bill, thanks for joining us again here on Reluctant Preppers.
Great to be here, Dunnigan. Thank you.
Before we launch into other topics, can you give us a recap of that point that I heard you talk about at the Liberty Mastermind Symposium about a successfully prosecuted case that you brought against regulators for not doing their job in the gold market?
Well, what we did, it really wasn't that dramatic, but we sued the Fed and were given by the court nearly $3,000 for documents that the Fed should have released and didn't. So, and there was a lot of other things they wouldn't allow them to release. So we got that far, and we pressed other, issues with everybody in Congress and had made other attempts in the legal system, and it obviously is difficult. That's why we were so delighted to see Deutsche Bank pay all those fines. I don't know, it was $38 million, and then it was $100 million or something like that. And then to hear what the individual bullion banks spoke to each other about in writing, it was just horrifying. It was beyond disgusting, and basically proved everything that God has been saying all these years about the bullion banks manipulating, the gold and silver markets, and of course the higher ups of the Fed, the Treasury, the Bank for International Settlements, and other central banks.
If you could recap that last point for us, that you're saying that was it through the legal process of prosecuting the powers that be that were prosecuting Deutsche Bank for illegal price fixing in the gold market turned up evidence, documentation about broader activities that had been going on all along? Is that where it came from?
Well, I don't want to be confusing here for your listeners. It was a Deutsche Bank case against the silver market manipulation, and it was proven that Deutsche Bank and was named other bullion banks what they were doing, and when they were doing it, and they had the audio input, and they also had written information and emails and other things, and it was just horrifying what they're able to prove. And we're hoping that case is going to lead to a bunch of other cases, because it's very obvious what's going on, and that's what God has been working on for 18 years.
If we could press a little bit farther in that, because I've heard you speak at conferences, and I have heard you speak on our channel when we've interviewed, and on other channels where you've been interviewed, consistently talking about this principle of gold price suppression through paper market manipulation, and yet we've continued to see certain naysayers and doubters claiming that this is all off target, and that actually it isn't price suppression; it's just natural price discovery with markets, and there's nothing going on here. So if you could set us straight, if you could just give us kind of like the kindergarten, first grade if second grade, if you could give us what are the things that you actually observe through the research you do at GATA.org. Now, you just mentioned actual sort of smoking gun documentation that was unearthed through legal proceedings. That's a big deal. Are there other specific things that you have observed and that GATA.org has through your research and through your market studies that you can point to and say this is an example of manipulation rather than that's just natural market activity?
Well, I'm prejudiced, but quite frankly, if anybody watches the gold and silver markets on a day-to-day basis and doesn't get it, they are morons. And I say that without trying to be flip or over the top. You truly have to be mentally challenged not to understand what's going on in the gold and silver market and what the gold cartel does. And to explain it, it's like to be like a murder trial. I mean, the evidence against these people is monumental, and you could go on and on and on, and it adds up. A jury would come out after listening and watching it all saying, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, there's so many things, and what they do on a daily basis, even in terms of the amount of futures markets they sell on gold price rises and so on. And just recently, the most ludicrous thing, and I used to be a pretty big commodity trader, I've ever seen in my entire life is what's going on in silver right now, after now 6 years of manipulating the price down by J.P. Morgan and friends. The open interest went to an all-time high. Normally, open interests go to all-time high when prices are going way up and hedgers jump in the market and so on. But this was just recently at 1850 a few weeks ago. And since then, it's gone straight down for 3 weeks with one update. 2 cents. I've watched markets trade for years, and markets just don't trade like this. And this was J.P. Morgan and their allies taking on the speculators in a way like never seen before to stop the price going up. It's when they stopped gold at around $12.90, and they've been driving it straight down ever since. And it's so obvious. I don't know how people can't understand it. I mean, what is there not to understand when these bullion banks have been fined for rigging the LIBOR rate, or the currency markets? They're fined billions of dollars. J.P. Morgan has been fined $33 billion over the past, 4 or 5 years for rigging markets. And the only market that they don't rig is gold and silver, these bullion banks? It is the silliest thing I've ever seen. And the reason that people won't go there is because the people doing it are the richest, most powerful people in the world. And the press is backing them up. God is not even allowed to be mentioned in many of the publications. It's ridiculous.
You mentioned that in the past that there is actually a media blackout of GATA and the evidence that they bring forward. Can you remind us of what are those specifics around that?
Yes. The lovely girl who works for Bloomberg in the gold market, it was for the last 18 years since we started, Claudia Carpenter, and John Emery and Chris Powell, and I met her in London. And she frankly told us that she's not allowed to mention GATA. Now, that was bad enough. So then we go to the World Gold Council to meet with them to help the industry and explain what's going on, and so maybe they could do something about it. And we get there, and they say, well, we want to see you. This was the top guy there. But you guys have to sign some kind of form that you were never here in the first place. Huh? I mean, we're going there to help the industry and help them, and it's so bad, it's such a big deal, that we have to sign a statement saying we were never there. I mean, I never heard of such a thing.
And back to the topic of the daily action that convinces you of price rigging, you said it's so obvious that you'd have to be crazy not to see it. So if you could just give us one or two specific kinds of examples. Does it have to do with action that's taken on specifically thin versus heavy trading days? You mentioned about trying to defending certain psychological price points to make sure they're not penetrated, but can you be specific on that?
Well, we're going back just to what happened recently. We were jumping up and down at what they were doing at the silver at 1850, and they were just selling like crazy to make sure it never got above that level. And the reason we think, and it's just my opinion, that they're going nuts, and that is a historic fact by the amount of open interest I just went into, is that silver is their kryptonite, and they're petrified of losing control of this market. It's gone on for far too long. We're now going into the 7th year. And they're afraid if it gets out of their control, there's going to be a panic to find silver supplies, which we think that they've gone through to in a great deal, and that they're gradually running out here, and that this is the last hurrah on the downside. I mean, what market goes down 14 days in a row? I mean, and they're doing it. I think this is their last hurrah because they've got to finally find a way to cover their massive short positions, and eventually they're going to be forced to let it go up. And if you watch the way these markets trade and the way gold will trade, for example, it won't do much, and then like yesterday, all of a sudden it lurches down, and when very few traders around $6, $7, $8, and a free market wouldn't trade like this, and gold and silver don't.
You mentioned that in the past as well. Can you talk a little bit more in detail about that? You mentioned at thin trading times when there's not sufficient liquidity because of a limited number of traders being active at that time, being used as opportune times to almost instantly drive the price, to severely different levels. Doesn't that happen in all markets, or is that you see that? Do you believe that that's happening? Is there any reason to think that that's not just coincidence? Is there something about the frequency with which you see it, or the extent to which it happens, or something like that? Well, again, if you could really help us understand.
That's a good point, and a fair one. Yes, it does happen in a lot of markets, but too often in the gold market, when we used to talk about it, they changed strategies. It used to be what I used to call Plan A. At 3 a.m. London time, it would happen sometime weeks in a row. You'd see the silver price go down at exactly that time, of 3 a.m. New York time, excuse me. And it happened over and over again. That's when they would in action. Then they used to go to Plan B, where they would, once the physical market was priced, they would sell on the COMEX once the physical market was done for the day. This used to happen over and over again. Then they will shift their strategies. I talk about the silver signal all the time. We thought it wasn't going to work this time. And I know Andrew Maguire used to explain this to the CFTC when they wouldn't let him speak in May of 2010. But you'll see them hit the silver market ahead of time, or a day ahead of time, or telling the other gold traders what's coming, so they don't get caught talking to each other over the phone or by emails. And you see the silver often just leads the way on the downside. And it's just happened again this past week. And it looked like, silver was lurching down. Would the silver signal work? We said, well, no, maybe it's not going to work this time. Boom, the last 2 days, gold collapses. There's all these little things, like I mentioned, that are clues to a murder. And you put them all together and you line them all up and you say, oh, my gosh.
So if these are so obvious, are there either yourself and your compatriots or others who are getting rich because they know how to follow these repetitive, obvious signals that are being sent and these strange market patterns that are happening?
Well, that's another good point, and I'm sure many of the gold traders' allies, that's exactly what they're doing. That's why silver, I think they've wiped the specs out 17 times in a row. It's hard to understand why these specs go long and don't tie up the physical market in the process. But gotta get in this for the big picture. I'm in it for the big picture and that's what I contribute to the party. If gold had kept up with inflation, it would be $3,300 an ounce. Silver is the most undervalued commodity in the world, and it's going to 100. There is no doubt in my mind. And when this thing explodes, when this thing goes up the next time, we're not going to have a move like we had at the beginning of the century, or for 10 to 12 years in the gold market, a gradual rise till the very end. This thing is going to explode out of nowhere and go bonkers. So my role is to keep people in the game for this one historic big move. Goda's role is just to explain what's going on in the gold market and expose the manipulation and suppression and try to do something about it. And, of course, that's what we've been trying to do all these years. And thank goodness at least some of these court cases have come out that have proved us to be correct. And, gold's been rigged for decades. As you go back to way back when. This is nothing new. They're just doing it surreptitiously and hiding it from everybody because gold is the barometer of U.S. Financial market health. Paul Volcker, the former Fed chairman, said gold up is bad, gold down is good. And that's extended to when Robert Rubin became Treasury Secretary. rigging the gold price was the essence of his strong dollar policy. And it could go on and on and on. And it goes back to when GATA got started, when the Bank of England sold half their gold, 400 tons of gold, announced it ahead of time and buried the gold price for 2 years. And that's what brought a lot of people, for example, to the GATA side. Nobody who wants to get an optimum price announces what you're going to do in advance for 2 years ahead to add supply. And yet they did that. And we know, we've learned since then that they were in trouble, and there was reasons they did it. And again, that's just part of the evidence in this, so in my, what I like to call, as an analogy, a murder trial.
And if we could now kind of zoom out to the bigger picture of assuming that this years and decades long game of this murder trial of price suppression has been afoot, what are the big trends that come out of that, and how does it affect the shift of power and so on in the world? You've talked in the past of the depletion of gold reserves in the West, and the accumulation and amassing of gold by China and Russia and others. As we look further into the 21st century, we're seeing a lot of volatility in political aggression and around the world. If we have a major upset in the power balance, what do you believe, what does GATA's research show as far as who's got the gold, and what does that say about the power structure that's coming in the 21st century? Well,
another good question, Dunnigan. And first of all, GATA would ask, why hasn't there been an audit of U.S. gold reserves? So I don't know, since maybe 1955. What thing in the world hasn't been audited in all this period of time? What are they afraid of? And of course, it's our conjecture that a lot of the gold isn't there, that it's been leased out and sold. The United States can't sell any gold reserves without an act of Congress, but we can lease our gold with other countries and sell their gold. And we believe that's what's been going on. As far as other countries, we know China's been buying like crazy, Russia's been buying, and there's other central banks are storing up on gold, to a certain degree. At some point, what is going to happen is something's going to occur when this gold cartel, as I call it, won't be able to come up with the physical gold supply and silver to continue going on what they're doing. And that's when we get this explosion out of nowhere. It's already gone on far too long, for what we thought it would, but that's the way it is. And it's building. And the longer it goes on, the more explosive the move's going to be when this thing blows up. And a lot of the gold is hypothecated. People have sold the same gold. There's talk about the volume and the numbers of the paper gold being 100 to 201 to the amount of the physical gold available. So eventually, at some point, it's going to lead to defaults, force majeures. It's going to be, for a scramble for who actually owns what gold and who doesn't have rights to it. It's coming. It's just taking a long time to get there.
You mentioned about physical gold not really being there and it being rehypothecated. For people who aren't familiar with that term, can you explain what rehypothecation is, why it adds risk to the ordinary investor?
Well, basically it would be, say, same claims, a number of claims to the same amount of physical gold that somebody owns that is saying you own this gold, but actually 10 people own it. And there's a very specific case of that which came out in court a few years ago about silver. Morgan Stanley got fined $2 million because they were telling people and charging people interest on silver they said they owned when they didn't own it because a bunch of people own the same silver. So it's that's a specific example that people can go to, and it's in the history books where they got fined for selling the same silver to people over and over again.
And in the situation that we find ourselves with this overselling or rehypothecation of gold, do you believe that there are any funds that actually possess the full amount of physical gold to match the stated value of what their fund actually claims? Because a lot of people we've talked with whether relatives, friends, and others talk about, well, they don't even know how you get started. They may have seen an ad on television saying, oh, you should consider having gold be part of your retirement plan or stable or whatever, but they don't know where to start. And they certainly don't want to start with hucksters that are selling them so-called numismatic or rare, higher than face value type collector's coins or something. They want to start with something that they believe is trustworthy. Do you believe that there are any funds that actually have the gold that they claim to have?
Well, I'm no expert there, but I'm a big fan of Eric Sprott and his funds, and not a finer guy around. There's going to be a big celebration for him coming up next Tuesday in Toronto, and his operation has all the gold there, and if people are interested, they can contact Sprott, and I'd vouch for them. If
in looking forward, you mentioned about this potential where there could be a evidence come out either because of the physical demand outstripping the available supply, or realization that there really is no significant supply that matches anywhere close to what people need. But from whatever the mechanism comes, what do you see as a realistic scenario going forward when those revelations are finally happen, and when that breakout finally occurs? You mentioned a little while ago here in this interview potentially gold catching up to its, or at least if it was at fair inflation adjusted value of $3,300 per ounce, or silver potentially to $100 per ounce. What do you see as the proper or natural ratio between those? What do you think? Because oftentimes where there's been mispricing, there'll be an overshoot on volatility. What will you be thinking that would tell you, okay, now we're in an overheated precious metals market. Now's the time I'm going to start reducing my position or shifting into some other asset. What levels would you be looking for before you would make that call? Boy, that'd be a fun day, I can tell you. Okay, but tell us what that day would look like. Well, first of all, be serious. To me, the key is going to be when silver takes out 21. That's when all heck breaks loose. And I think you're going to see it move, going to blow past 50 and get up past 100. So, and there's no telling what it could go to when you get to that point. And that'll be a point, for me to, certainly to be lightening up when it gets there. Many people know, we've been stuck and going nowhere for years. The biggest moves are made at the very end of the market. And a lot of times by momentum players that had never went through all this aggravation that we're going through now. So want to be careful not to get out too early. But I think you're going to see that, and you're going to see, gold take out its old highs and get through 2000. It's all going to depend on really what's going on in the world. Nobody knows what can happen nowadays because of the use of derivatives. I mean, it's helped them control the gold and silver markets like we could never have thought of, 5-10 years ago. It's massive. I mean, J.P. Morgan, for example, has a secret operation, and this is according to Jamie Dimon, not, Conspiracy Bill here, where they trade $2 trillion. Is that your nickname? No, I just call myself that. Go ahead. That trades $2 trillion a day in Florida. I mean, that's a fact again. This is not me making this up. So they're being able to control not only the gold and silver markets, but all markets now. And that's, in my opinion, what they did after the Trump win. And it stayed that way with the stock market, and it killed gold and silver and jerked the stock market up. Nobody thought Trump would be good for the market. Not one person ahead of time said he would be good. They all sold the futures market when they thought he could win. And of course, no one thought he could win. And so then it's changed everything. And one of my favorite expressions is price action makes market commentary, and to change the whole psyche of markets. And of course, they've done that ever since Trump came in. And I think they're trying to hold this whole thing together with derivatives. So if some black swan ever kicks in, and of course you're never aware of it, that's by definition what it is, that upsets the derivative markets, it'd be like a nuclear transaction bomb going off. It's just one reaction after another. And very few people can predict something like this. But it's going to be a big scandal, just like Madoff was, and just like Enron was. And people tried to expose Madoff, and nobody would listen to them. And people tried to expose Enron, they got fired. Fortune had Enron, I think, the #1 company in the U.S. 5 years in a row. It was a fraud.
And that's what's going on in the gold and silver markets now, and I think it'll be the biggest financial scandal in U.S. history once it breaks. It's taken forever, but it's coming.
Well, it's got to be. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about was you've mentioned how wearing it's been on those who have been holding on to common sense sanity of real money, sound assets through this long and grinding period. But what do you think that tells us about when the sentiment? You mentioned earlier about open interest, but what does sentiment tell you? And is it when we reach a low enough ebb on sentiment that finally those who are actually, that seems to be actually a stated or unstated goal of those who would be doing suppression, is trying to manage public opinion and sentiment, as you mentioned, even quoting Paul Volcker from the old days. So what does the current sentiment among those that you've talked to? You travel and you visit these various precious metals conferences and so on. What is the sentiment in the industry, both from the production side, exploration, production, and those who are amassing those assets on sort of the sentiment side, and what does that tell us about the future?
Well, what I can speak to, this is the worst sentiment and the worst time it's in the last 20 years for me and for all the people I know in the business. Investor interest has collapsed, and part of it's just common sense in the sense why you've got the Dow goes up and up and up and up, the gold and silver go down, and the gold and silver shares get killed, and it's been 5 6 years of a bear market, and it's going to be great, but it never is. Bitcoin's going nuts. God bless those people. They're having a field day. Real estate soaring. What stinks? Gold and silver, and it stunk for too long, and it's all part of this rigging operation. You've had zero interest rates. You've had quantitative easing like crazy. You've got assets going nuts. And to hide really what's going on or to defer from it, the gold cartel takes gold and silver down when it should be going up. Now they talk about some piddly interest rate hikes and they say it's going to be bearish for gold. Well, why wasn't the collapse of interest rates bullish for gold?
Yeah.
I mean, and this has worn people out. And I know in the late 70s, investors were in the gold and silver markets for years, and a lot of them quit right before the big move in 79 and 80. And it was the momentum guys that stepped in and made the money. And, I'm as optimistic as I can be, and I know an explosion's coming. But I can't tell you when, because somebody's going to set it off that we can't predict. And any of us that have been bullish the past couple of years, well, we're wrong.
That outlook that you hold onto for eventual recovery of physical gold and silver, other than the confidence that suppression games, that any game can only go on so long before the game's up, is there anything else intrinsically about gold and silver that lead you to that confidence, or does it come back to that they are hedges against uncertainty, and you just see so many risks in the modern world that if there's a serious negative event, you think that could be a trigger for a release of public sentiment in a flight to safety, that sort of thing?
Well, it's a good point. What will happen is demand, which is now disappearing. I mean, it's very strong in many countries in the East and the West. And again, they created this whole psyche about what's going on. Meanwhile, they're using up their supplies to continue to keep the price down. I think the most important thing, at least for myself, is to understand what the gold cartel has done and how artificially low the prices of gold and silver are. And think of it like a stretched rubber band. And when this thing moves the other way, look out, because demand will go from nothing to bonkers. And meanwhile, the supply will have been greatly diminished. And you'll see a whole different dynamic. And that's knowing what I know and try to help people with understanding what this gold cartel has done is why I'm so excited about what's coming down the road. But in the meantime, it's been a horror show.
A horror show for people who are ready to turn a profit, but for those who are still wanting to accumulate, can you talk a little bit about that, what the opportunity that it provides?
Well, as you said, the sentiment, it's an ideal time, and of course that's when people are running away. And you're absolutely correct. In terms of of buying when nothing's wanted or a contrarian sort of thing, now's the time when everyone's piling into these other assets, and they may crash and they may not. I mean, there's talk about the Irish stock market and the Toronto house market, and all different the stock market and the valuations and stuff like that. Well, I leave that to other people, but I know rarely have gold and silver ever been cheaper relative to everything else, especially in history, because as a result of what I call the bad guys, what they've done. And so if people, looking around what to do, as you say, now is an ideal time to be accumulating, silver and gold. I mean, look at silver. I mean, it was, it's the price where it is, close to 16, when it was at $50 an ounce 37 years ago. I mean, what other commodity has done anything like that? And it's an example of the pressure building up in this market once the J.P. Morgan crowd is forced to let it go up.
Well, Bill, any final thoughts you want to leave with our audience, including how they can find out more of your work online?
Well, I'd go to www.gata.org. My colleague Chris Powell does a great job to sign up there. And then I write LaMetropolcafe.com. I've done it since September 1998. People can sign up for a 2-week free trial. And all I can say is you'd ask great questions, and it's a pleasure to be on your show anytime. And I just hope the next time that I'm on that it's in a real positive note about what's occurring, not moaning and groaning, because that's not my nature at all.
Well, Bill, if one of the things that a vigilante has to do is moan and groan about corruption and illegal practices and unnatural price suppression, we'll take that. So, because we're glad you're in our corner, we're glad you're looking out for things. So, just thanks for joining us always here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you, Dunnigan.